Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first edition of Viewing Room at Peoria Riverfront Museum. We are working live. This is our maiden voyage. Be kind to us. We are very excited about tonight. We have some amazing content for you. Let me do some quick introductions. I am Bill Conger. I'm curator of collections and exhibitions at Peoria Riverfront Museum. And I will be kind of facilitating tonight's discussion. Along with me, I have board member of Peoria Riverfront Museum, who also is a neurologist at OSF HealthCare Systems in Peoria, Illinois. OSF is short for Order of St. Francis, which is perfectly appropriate tonight. And we are proud to have St. Francis, the Order of St. Francis hospital system, headquartered in Peoria, Illinois. It's one of the largest in the state. And with us, we have Dr. Sarah Zallek. Sarah, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here and represent the Peoria Riverfront Museum Board and listen to you as experts talk about some really fun art that relates to us as a museum and to the interests of the audience, and also because we're going to be talking about St. Francis, since I work at OSF St. Francis at the Third Order of St. Francis is our sisters order who run our healthcare system, OSF HealthCare. St. Francis is very special to us as an organization, and so it's really fun to merge together this discussion of art and St. Francis.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for being here tonight. And we're also happily joined by a friend of mine, a friend of the museum, Peoria Riverfront Museum's honorary guest curator, confidant, and friend. Also an accomplished scholar in the Italian Renaissance, former director of the Memphis Brooks Museum in Memphis, Tennessee. Bill Heidrich is with us also.
Bill, it's great to be here with you and with Sarah to have an opportunity to take a look at this marvelous painting.
The painting we're going to look at, Bill and Sarah, I thought I would use an amazing resource that we have, we all have in our grasp, and it's called Google Arts and Culture. So I'm going to turn my screen and share it with you, and hopefully show you this wonderful piece that we're going to speak about tonight. This, of course, is the 15th century artist Giovanni Bellini. And this work, St. Francis in the Desert, otherwise known as the Ecstasy of St. Francis, is, of course, housed at the Frick Collection, which, if you've never been to the Frick Collection, the Pittsburgh industrialist Henry Clay Frick, his absolutely stellar New York Gilded Age era mansion is turned into one of the most prestigious museums in America and in the world along Fifth Avenue in New York City. Please go, and if you go, make sure to, you won't miss, but maybe to bring you there if the St. Francis piece is not enough. See the Jean-Honoré Fragonard's, the Fragonard room at the Frick Collection. So with that being said, I wanted to mention, and I'm not going to get in deep into this because I know how to get in trouble, but what we are seeing just in a quick view, kind of novice art guy's view, is a moment where St. Francis has been interrupted, and he's been interrupted from basically a retreat. He is communing. And in setting this night up for you, we reached out to Sister Judith Ann Duvall from the Order of St. Francis OSF Medical System to be with us here tonight. She was unable to, but she did provide a little statement that I'm going to share with you. And on retreat, her heart is with us. Of course, that moment of being transformed into the living image of Christ with the marks of passion on his body was the most transforming moment in St. Francis's life. Did you know what he was praying for? Just before he received these marks, he was meditating on the passion of Christ and asked Christ for the gift of being about to experience in his body all the pain, suffering Christ experienced on the cross. And also for the love in his heart that Christ had in his heart that enabled him to endure such suffering for love for all of us, so precious. And so we wanted to thank Sister Judith Ann for being here in spirit tonight. So we will go back to this magnificent work. And Bill Heidrich, where do we start here? Where do we begin?
Let's begin with Mr. Frick. He bought this painting in 1915. It's remarkable in the Frick collection because he did not necessarily have a disposition towards religious works of art. And yet here, what is to most of us in our minds, the greatest picture at the Frick is a very religious one. It was done about 1475 to 1480. For those who haven't seen it, it's a fairly large picture. It's oil on panel. It measures roughly 4 by 4.5 feet. And in part because it has hardly moved since Mr. Frick bought it in 1915, it comes down to us in a remarkable state of preservation. The oil on the wood is so rich and so well preserved, it's as if the painting was finished just a little while ago. Obviously, it is depicting the moment when St. Francis is receiving the stigmata. It's done, though, in a new and an imaginative way that we haven't seen before in art history. Bellini takes several exceptions to the way this is normally depicted. And one of them that I think is quite meaningful, that I hope we can explore a little bit later, is he does not include all of the symbols that one normally finds in a painting of this type. To that point, the evidence of the transfiguration occurs explicitly in his hands and possibly in his foot. We do not see the wound that was inflicted on his side by the soldiers to ensure that he was dead, nor do we see the seraphim up in the sky depicting the crucified Christ. Instead, what we see off to the left is a tree slightly bending and illuminated by a divine light, which is coming down and in fact illuminating the figure of St. Francis there in the center of the picture. And it's quite interesting that the figure of St. Francis is bathed in this divine light. It's rather warm, yet he's set in this austere, cool background. The rocky background in the cave off to the right explicitly recall the area where he was on retreat, La Verna, near Arezzo, Italy. Curiously, though, and it would have been curious to the eye of the beholder of someone at the time, we see off in the distance, not an actual town, but structures that anyone in the Veneto, the area around Venice, would recognize as buildings typical, characteristic of that time. But the actual village, if you will, is the artist's invention. We also see, in contrast to the austerity of the craggy, rocky area where he has been meditating, we see an abundance of details suggesting the beginning of spring, and also a delight, a fascination in nature. We know that St. Francis saw in nature God's work everywhere. And at the time that this painting was done, there was a resurgent interest in nature, in literature, and almost a contest, if you will, between people who were writing, which was more powerful, the written word or the painted word? Could one compete with the other, and which one was really the best?
I'm really fascinated by that, Bill, that this idea that there was a little bit of a tussle, right, between this idea of poetry, and what I mean by poetry is the magic that exists within whatever we're talking about, the poem or the painting. And there was a little bit of an argument about which of these forms was delivering the content better. And I'm just fascinated by that. And I don't know if you have more to add on that, but there is such a moving kind of energy in this piece that you can tell that how do you discuss light without showing it, for example? And painting certainly wins in this one, I think.
I agree with you. I think it's important to also remember that St. Francis himself wrote a lot about nature in a great deal of detail. And certainly we see nature depicted here in abundance. There is a tendency to try to interpret the layered meanings of suggestions or references that could be embedded in this painting. I think, though, that its presence is more to suggest and depict an idealized environment and to make suggestions to connect the viewer's ideas with other thoughts, whether it's things that he's just read or things that he's aware of or things that he's experienced himself. Now, it's important in this background, we connect this with the so-called Renaissance, which is the rebirth of classicism. From certainly the early 14th century on, there was a rekindled interest in the poets of the past. And frankly, much of the writings of theirs, as well as the contemporary writings, fit beautifully with St. Francis's writings, this love of nature, this interest in nature. Now, it's also interesting at this point, by the middle of the 15th century, for people that are interested in classical literature, with the fall of Constantinople and its having bad times before, suddenly manuscripts that had never existed in any form at all are appearing in the West. For example, it wasn't until into the 14th century that a copy of Plato's Republic even existed in the West. Same is true of Aristotle's Politics. So what's happening here is a renewed acquaintance with things from the past, and it helps it inform this heady environment of really well-educated people who are interested in these things, thinking about these things, talking about these things. And so I think with a picture like this, one of the interesting questions to ask is, who was it intended for? Where was it intended to go? And if you can show us there some of the glorious details, the craggy sticks in the foreground, the raw, cool colored rocks. And if you back up a little bit, you can see that fish below the water spout. Or no, that's the kingfisher right below the water spout.
Kingfisher, yeah, the bird, right.
Yeah. There's a feast of visual inclusions that makes this a very sensuous and sumptuous work of art. We believe that it was commissioned by a fellow by the name of Michiel. And that, I think, fits with the picture that we see today. It's not an explicit sort of hit you over the head depiction of St. Francis. He is small in the scene. If this was intended for a chapel or an ecclesiastical building, there would have been much more emphasis on St. Francis himself. And also, since we believe it was a private commission, the artist had some freedom, some choices that he could make in how he interpreted the image of the saint himself, doing things like not including all of the sort of required representations of the stigmata.
So Bill Heidrich, can you tell us, as you're talking, I'm listening to you talk about how he might have conceived this painting and it was commissioned and what drove him to balance the image like he did. Tell us more about Bellini. I don't know a lot about him and his work and why he might have been in the position to paint this particular image.
Sure.
And his other works.
Bellini actually comes from a family of artists. His father, Giovanni, was an artist, as well as his brother Gentile, his half-brother. Giovanni was the bastard. His sister married a very important artist, Andrea Mantegna. So art was in the family. unfortunately, we know very little. We have very little original documentation of his work, commissions, contracts to do different things. And why this is the case, I don't know, but it is the case for Venetian artists that we know we have very little archival information about them as compared to Florentine artists. Bellini was an artist who was a successful portrait painter in addition to the many works he did for churches. That would have been his bread and butter. He was one of the most successful artists of that moment in Venice, and he was recognized and held in high esteem by a subsequent generation of artists. In fact, it's interesting, and I think this further enhances the secular origin of the work. The painting turns up in 1525 in the Contarini collection, and we know from someone's visit to that collection, he describes the painting, and it is on display with several other paintings, not all of which are religious. In fact, I think, Bill, you might have an image of one of the other paintings that it was shown with. A painting by Giorgione called The Three Philosophers.
Here you go.
This painting dates maybe 30 some years later. And there's an interesting question that emerges. The two paintings are nearly identical in size. And we know that the Bellini, perhaps 5 centimeters of the upper top of the painting was removed at some point. We don't know if it was to make it conform into some sort of display setting, damage, whatever. But we find in 1525, the owner happily exhibiting these secular and profane works right alongside each other. And it sort of shows us that at that time, the cultured elite were very comfortable and at ease addressing issues of religious significance right along with philosophical issues at the very same moment.
Did Bellini have much influence on people who came after him? You said people regarded him well, but do you think he had an impact in other people's work?
Yes, he did. He had a profound influence on this artist, Giorgione, which we see in the interest, particularly in landscape, that we see reaching a high note in the painting at the Frick. Another artist who overlapped with Giorgione, Titian, also shared that same interest in landscape, seemed to have been borrowed from Bellini. Scholars have also noted that Bellini in turn was influenced by 2 other artists. One, Jan van Eyck, a specific painting which came to Venice in 1571, which would have been available to him. Van Eyck painted in a very naturalistic, almost hyper-realistic style and included landscape as an important element of his work. Another painter with whom he may have been quite familiar, Antonello da Messina, who came from southern Italy, but had learned how to paint in oils from the Netherlandish masters. And with oil, you now have a technique which allows you to really be much more specific, more refined, more detailed in what you do.
And where are other significant Bellini paintings?
One of my favorites, painting of the Doge, is at the National Gallery, London. Fortunately, several are still in their original settings in Italy. A trip to Venice will be very rewarding. There are wonderful Bellinis in the museum there. There's a Bellini in the National Gallery, Washington. The Met has one, I believe. They're around. He was not a prolific artist, but he's one that's been held in high esteem in subsequent times and has been quite sought after. One of the things, while we're talking about the landscape, that I think is quite clever that Bellini has done, and it is his own invention, is how he juxtaposed the narrative content of depicting St. Francis at the cave with a very plausible transition into that local Venetian environment, an environment which, as I noted, was depicted in a warm, light, probably early morning, whereas there's this curious blue light bathing the stones around St. Francis. Of course, that could be a useful device to offset the depiction of divine light coming from that tree. I would also like to point out sort of a personal thing. I found after this painting was cleaned, that the light hitting St. Francis, you're much more aware of the artist's intention to have you feel that the light is reflecting on you, the viewer. There is a warmth that emanates from it, as if to literally connect us with the saint as he's experiencing Christ's passion.
Bill, can I interrupt real fast? I was remiss at the beginning of this. I wanted to make sure that our viewers knew that we would love to have questions from them. And so if they have anything they'd like to know, please feed them through. We'll try to make sure that we get them. You know, you were mentioning the kind of strange space. You were mentioning the light here. I have a question about the physical space, if I can get this guy to just sit still. What we have here is, you know, this depiction of Laverna, you know, the crags, the rock, the cave, which creates these wonderful entry points. You know, the cave here, which mimics, I guess, the cave that, you know, obviously Christ would ultimately be, see his end in, or his human end in. And then this weird space where this is like his office. This is St. Francis's workspace. And of course, he's left his shoes in the space, as we can see. There are so many interesting kind of storytelling elements here. But certainly the thing that perplexes me, and I do not understand it, perhaps we can work through it. I've learned that maybe some of these little critters are not, would not be, and are not indigenous to Italy or Europe at all, for that matter. That this, perhaps, given the title, we are talking about some kind of imagined magic, kind of metaphysical space that isn't necessarily Italy, and it may not, you know, necessarily be. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a very good question. And it also helps me get to something where I was going to sort of put myself out on a limb about one aspect of this painting.
Sure.
I think what Bellini is working very hard to do is to create, although it's a very serene moment, in terms of what the saint is experiencing, it's highly charged. It's a very powerful moment.
Yes.
And you see him having left his workspace suddenly. So suddenly he's left his shoes behind. He didn't put them on to enter into this other space. And as we see his posture, and I go back to that light, which you can see now better since the painting was cleaned in 2010, it feels almost as if he's slightly levitated. He's hardly on the ground, and it is a sacred space. And that forward thrusting foot doesn't look like it can do a very good job holding him up. I think that is to bring in some unbalance. And I have a thought on why the craggy rocks are painted in this cool blue light. And also perhaps why Bellini did not include all of the attributes of the Transfiguration. And we don't have one handy. If you look at some of the paintings of the living Christ while he's being crucified, he does not yet have the wound on the side that the soldier delivered to ensure that he was dead. He's still alive.
Wow.
We don't see that wound here.
Right.
Other paintings that Bellini has done of St. Francis, the typical program is that wound is there. So I think he's suggesting another moment. And I think he's actually suggesting a very specific moment in the death of Christ on the cross. If you recall from scripture, when Christ uttered his last words, the world darkened.
Wow.
If you wanted to suggest that very moment that this is the moment that St. Francis is embracing, is accepting into his life, that he is experiencing. You're going to see it without the wound, but how do you suggest the darkening of the world? My thought is what Bellini has done is depicted the lighting of an eclipse. An eclipse is something that would have been familiar to his viewers. I checked on the NASA website. In the 15th century, there were 222 eclipses. Of those, I want to get the number, I think 60 were total eclipses and approximately 90 were partial eclipses. So the light effect of an eclipse would have been known to an Italian at this time viewing this painting. And if you can remember from experiencing an eclipse, the world darkens,
Right.
and the colors shift to the cool blue spectrum.
Absolutely.
So if you're going to suggest that moment when Christ utters his last words, when he actually dies,
yeah,
you're going to depict the saint without all of the characteristics of the transfiguration, and you're going to suggest the darkening of the world in the space where the saint is, not in the background of the Veneto of this imaginary landscape that he's created. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It isn't, when we see the other depictions of St. Francis, we're left with a sense of, well, he's now wounded. He feels the wounds, but did he really feel what it was like to die? Right. This painting, I think, suggests that is what's going on. He is feeling the actual death of Christ at that moment when he's uttered his last words. The world has darkened, and he has the wounds. I've never read that anywhere. That's my interpretation. It's how I react to it.
That's powerful. There are so many allusions to the crucifixion. Of course, the grafted grapevine behind him, simulates a kind of cruciform with the grafted plant onto it. Behind that is, we have, of course, the skull where he is ruminating on the crucifixion. The actual desk itself, a kind of a nod to carpentry, of course, Christ's lifetime work as a carpenter referenced as well. Is it kind of impossible to say how radically new this painting would have been in terms of storytelling at the time?
Well, as I said, and unfortunately we don't have one of the conventional depictions of St. Francis. And at the risk of, I don't mean to offend anyone who quite likes them, but I find them they're stiff, they seem forced, there's not much naturalistic about it. The artists struggle to get all the wounds in there. They struggle to get the divine light. They struggle to get the little symbol of Christ on the cross. It gets away from the message of what it is that St. Francis, receiving the stigmata, what this was all about, experiencing Christ's suffering, a human being experiencing this, and him then being able, I think in this instance, as I read this painting, as we feel the reflected light from him, we are in a position of having him as an intermediary for us, which is the role of saints, but also someone with whom we can connect and we can think about. And I think for the educated, highly educated minds of the Venetians at this time, this would be a great point on which to go into lots of discussions, thoughts, and meditations. And while you're at it, what's wrong with discussing philosophy?
Right.
Having another painting nearby.
Listening to you, oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's important for us to understand that not all religious paintings live their lives in a religious context at this time. And this is different. This is a different thing at this moment. This is an emergence. This is a change that we haven't seen much of before. No, go ahead, Sarah.
Well, yeah, just thinking of his stance and as he's receiving these wounds and sort of experiencing the last moments of Christ himself, it's an interesting look. If you go back to St. Francis, the image, if you open up the painting a little bit, back out of the painting, who's driving the painting? Is that you, Bill Conger?
I'm trying to steer it, yes.
Okay, so back out a little bit. And if you look at St. Francis,
Yes.
he doesn't look, he looks accepting. And I mean, he might look a little worried, but, but the whole painting to me is curious because it's not, you're right, it's not a typical religious painting and it's not focused on him. It's focused on the surrounding experience, but his role in this painting visually is small, but also very vulnerable. And to me, he looks very accepting. When we talked earlier about him looking like he's standing in nature, and he gave his life up to Christ, but nature and the world around him. Really willingly gave up all of his personal possessions. He gave up his clothes, and he sort of walked away from his life of things and connection to his family and everything. I gather he walked away with embracing no material objects and just a robe. And then here is really ultimately, I think, without sounding like too much conjecture, I think he's just sort of, he looks vulnerable but at peace to me. He looks like he's kind of taking the hit for everyone else. Like he's accepting the pain of that Christ experienced, but he's got his foot out in an unbalanced way. He could be tipped over easily, and he looks like he's making himself actively vulnerable, which I think is sort of the beauty of the painting. The other curiosity to me is that the way this is framed makes me want to look. I just want to look around inside that room. It looks like it makes me so curious to see what's in there. And I did that very intentionally.
Well, it's tantalizing with all the detail, including the desk, the skull, the book, the slight screen of sticks, the elements. I don't think, though, that it was Bellini's intention to get too didactic with the things that he represented. Mm-hmm. I feel that he leans much more towards the suggestive, and I say that in part because of looking at some of the ones that he had done. By the way, when I make reference to the other depictions of St. Francis, those were for public spaces. Mm. But if we look at the work of his brother-in-law, he's very detailed. He's very sort of intellectual about it, and almost piles on all the references and the specificity of things. And that's why, as we see that cityscape in the distance, it does not specifically depict a particular town. I had to say something, though, that not to take this to a lower level, but there's another painting that he did for an order, I believe it was in Pesaro, an order that was somewhat in competition with another order in Venice. And when he did the scene in the distance, the cityscape, he used as a model for the church in the background, the Church of the Rivals in Venice for the people in Pesaro. Was that intentional, or was he up to something? Don't know. But I think in this picture, the idea was simply to suggest it, to try to connect our world with the world of St. Francis. And I don't know what the sense of historicism was at this time, but if the painting is, let's call it 12 or 1475, it's not that much earlier, 1224, that Francis had experienced the stigmata. And certainly from our perspective in time, this painting is much closer to his actual existence than it is to ours.
Beautiful. So Bill, we referenced, this laurel tree that is completely getting brutalized here by something, and we assume that it's this all-encompassing light. And I love doing this.
Can you get in close?
I want to go close, way into this thing, so we can see the marks, the impasto, the wonderful paintwork. This will iron out here. Hold on here. And my question to you, this is not a new concept. We are
There we go. The rays. You got the
There
rays.
they are. Could the missing portion that you referred to earlier have had the seraphim in that portion? And what do you? There are different points of view on this. Leaving the seraph out, which would have been a six-winged kind of angel that would have been the deliverer of the stigmata, which typically would have been included in a piece like this. Again, that radical storytelling.
Hold it right there.
You got it. You got it.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. I wanted you to hold the slot where you're where you have the image. Well, the fact that a little bit of the top is missing is suggestive that perhaps it was removed. It's hard looking at the other pictures that date to this time period. If you consider the notion that Bellini probably ordered several of these supports at the same time, it's very, very close in size to the other paintings of this moment. So we conclude that it was only maybe 5 centimeters. I want to believe that he didn't include it, just as he didn't make the image of St. Francis so explicit. And I think, though, that as we see here, these rays, which suggest the divine light, the power, the presence of the divine light, it comes down, illuminates slightly that laurel tree, blows it some, and it is the light that connects down and illuminates St. Francis. It is the divine light. So I think that it wasn't necessary for us to really have a full understanding of the painting. And by deleting it, it removes something that I think could be a distraction, and instead focuses on the moment itself. I'm not sure. I think if my idea is sound, that Bellini is really trying to focus on that precise moment when Christ dies, that the seraphim would have been a distraction to making that suggestion. Brilliant. If in fact he's depicting the light effects of an eclipse, which is what they would recognize as, and then suddenly the earth got dark for a short period of time, and then it got light again. An eclipse, the suggestion of an eclipse would I think do that marvelously. Wow. And the seraphim would be a distraction from that, in my mind. That's us looking at. What's exciting, though, is the kind of lively discussion we're having right now. I wonder what Mr. Frick thought in 1915. A man who had amassed a huge fortune. He was a very clever, gifted businessman who at times indulged in many of those things that we wish the robber barons, that class of people, had not done. He was instrumental in breaking up some very important strikes in which people were killed, people striking, working for him. Maybe there was, in later life, some spiritual connection with this painting. I'd like to think that might be known. I don't know if his diaries or his comments, thoughts exist. We do know that he quite loved, at the end of the day, by himself, going into the galleries, much as they appear today, and spending time with these great works of art, as we do today.
The Frick collection, which you both know, was built as his home, but also designed, I gather, as designed specifically to become a museum. He knew he was doing this, but it was in a place, and correct me if I've learned this incorrectly, but it was in a place when we visited, our fabulous docent gave us lots of good stories, including that it was in a place that couldn't have a museum. It wasn't zoned for a museum. It wasn't a welcome thing, but I gather he built it specifically to house his art collection he was amassing, and wanted to have gatherings. When he came from Pittsburgh to New York, I understand he was an industrialist, but not welcome in the established circles of New York, and he tried to make his way by putting a big house on a big piece of real estate in town and turning it into an art museum. So it's, I think I would be curious to know what attracted him to this painting and if there was any religious connection at all, but I think he was tremendously driven to buy important art and show important art in his home, knowing that it would be a museum experience eventually. Am I misdirected, or did I get that right?
No, I think you're spot on. And I will, another bias of mine, I quite like these museums that started off as houses. The Huntington Gallery in San Marino is another example.
Yeah.
And you see things, one of the beauties of it is, especially at the Frick, where it's just masterpiece after masterpiece, you see works juxtaposed and placed in settings that you don't, nothing against the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but they don't have the opportunity to juxtapose paintings from different moments, different times, and to put them in an environment where, despite the fact that it is a mansion on Fifth Avenue, it is an attractive human scale place that
a single walkable space. You can walk through the entire Frick and experience the entire museum. Yes.
And it was modified after he died. That wonderful, slightly sunken garden and fountain was added after he died. And most people are astonished to know that, because it feels like an integral part of the experience of the Frick. But no, absolutely, he had this in mind from the beginning, and he deserves enormous credit for having a great eye. Certainly, the best dealers in the world were bringing him the best things, but he had to make decisions. And you would be getting off the subject, but there were other American collectors who bought from the same dealers who didn't manage to bring home the masterpieces that Frick did. Frick was, though, such a presence that he could make demands of some of the dealers. For instance, when the Morgan collection was sold, Lord Devine was one of the principal dealers handling that. And Frick simply told him, if you don't give me first option on the things, I won't buy anything. Which is how Frick was able to acquire the wonderful Fragonard room, which is on display at the Frick. And also that came from Morgan. And the glorious collection of bronzes that all came from Morgan. And again, Frick said, if you show them to somebody else, I'm not buying any of them. But he had good taste. He bought well. It's not a collection that, there was another collection, the Lehman collection, much of which is on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, formed somewhat later. Lehman had some of the same taste as Frick, but in the areas where they definitely overlapped, I think that the works that Mr. Frick bought has stood up to the test of time a lot better than the ones that Lehman bought. And they very wealthy men buying from some of the same sources.
Well, he had the art of negotiation and the art of taste, it sounds like.
And a big checkbook.
Yeah, right.
These are not inexpensive things. Yeah. I'm not familiar with some of the prices that Frick paid off the top of my head. And I don't know if he was doing it on purpose, but you mentioned the thing about trying to sort of make a splash in New York society. As soon as he had to create a ghost entity to buy up the lots that now constitute the property there on Fifth Avenue and 70th. And of course, it was front page news when it leaked out. And then when he would buy some expensive work of art, it'd get in the paper. And at that time in America, the amounts of money these people were paying, I think, you adjust for dollars and you do this and you do that. But for most Americans, this was really a great distance from anything with which they were familiar. Somebody spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on these works of art. It was just so far from anything with which they were familiar. And that kind of wealth had never existed in America. Bill,
I have one, actually, I have a million more questions. I don't know how how much more you can endure from me. But there are so many things. As I listen to your wonderful discussion and the give and take between you and Sarah, I'm just kind of marveling at some of the entrances to this piece. And I'm noticing this wonderfully, if you follow my cursor, this kind of framed in shepherd. And it's framed in with these perfectly placed young saplings with sheep, of course, framed inside. I mean, I guess in the world of Bellini, if we can see the reference, it's probably there. I assume we're looking at God, we're looking at Moses, we're looking at the metaphorical flock, right? Everything is a story in here.
I think what I would say in response, which is, I think, answering your question or your comment, is that yes, it's all structured. He made choices. Now, just to expand on that slightly, the Bellini family had sketchbooks, which have come, most of which have come down to us. It's a marvelous, marvelous trove of just wonderful, wonderful drawings. And these would become stock elements that the father would use, the sons might use, and you see elements reoccur. So in that sense, there's certain borrowings, or there's a ready-made, if you will, that gets included. But I agree with you. This is a purposeful framing. Exactly why, I don't know. Perhaps to draw more attention to it. Because when you look at the painting, it's sort of those framing elements that cause you to say, gee, there's a shepherd with his sheep. And this, of course, is a heavily loaded, this heavily loaded symbolism in Christianity, and open to numerous connections and references in Christian theology.
This radical use of light, which you've so beautifully kind of put in context for us, Bill, is there a way to convey to our audience how important this work is in establishing Venetian Renaissance art, and where Bellini situates in the trajectory of Venetian painting beyond this point?
Sure. First of all, with reference to the cool sort of bluish tone he uses, as far as I know, this is the only instance in which he uses it. Again, I'll also say that with the other depictions that he's done of St. Francis, off the top of my head, I believe they were all for public spaces. This doesn't occur, but we do get the full roster of symbols that make it quite explicit.
Yeah.
What we see here is something created at a moment. Again, I refer back to some of the literature at the time, what the learned people were thinking about, what they were talking about, what they were discussing. This is something which would have been just rich for references. So in the sense that it's loaded with those, it connects it to that time.
Sure.
What Bellini has done, which is so important here, is change the discussion about how these landscapes could be created. He really has two different spaces that he's trying to suggest. Yet he seamlessly, it's a bit abrupt of a difference, but we are comfortable with the juxtaposition of these two spaces.
Yeah.
In this magnificent view, this marvelous depiction of what would be familiar countryside in the area now becomes a mainstay in Venetian art of the Renaissance, on and through. Titian dies. He's sort of the last of the great ones of this. He's later, but I think he dies in the 1560s. So there are definitely links between them, and references and awareness of each other's work.
Oh, excellent.
Maybe another question or two, and then we can let our viewers get on to dinner or whatever.
Of course, yes. We're good. I know. I told you I'd wear you out, Bill.
Or I've got to get on to dinner.
It's fun to have time to spend on one painting. It's fun to go to a museum and see paintings by ourselves, and it's fun to go with somebody who knows. And here we are all at home. I just want to say before we carry on with whatever our last questions are, you all invited me because we're part of the museum family, and it's fun to be part of this. And I'm an expert listener, and you guys are experts on the art. And it's really, I love going to museums, and I've had the pleasure of being in a lot of them, including the Frick collection. And that experience of seeing a painting on my own, even as somebody who knows maybe more than average about art, but less than an expert level, is very different than walking through it and having the pleasure of time. And here we are all stuck in our houses, most of us, not able to go to museums, and having the whole world open up, and to have the pleasure of you just sort of driving around the painting in this super high resolution access on, is Google Art, what are we on, Bill?
Google Arts and Culture, yes.
Google Arts and Culture. What a wide open window for us. And I think this is, it's a nuanced conversation, and it's of interest to whoever's maybe listening to us now or later. But what a fun way to be able to poke around and explore and think about without over evaluating and making assumptions about a beautiful piece of art that's much more interesting when you have a conversation about it. So I just wanted to say thanks for inviting me to talk about this, to learn about this and listen to you guys, and just kind of take time to sit back and look in depth at something beautiful. I hope we do more of this.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This wouldn't have been the same without you. Your insights are just razor sharp, and that's why we asked you to come on with us. And this has just been, I can totally concur. It's been an amazing amount of time picking Bill's brain and discovering this painting all over again. Bill, do you have anything to close out with?
Just Sarah, thank you for joining us. You are a great listener. Bill, thank you for leading us. Sort of basic comment. The painting as you're seeing it here is really what it looks like. Quite often, when you see them reproduced, this is just a marvelous, marvelous reproduction. The only thing I would say is when you experience it at the Frick, it's a little bit brighter, but that's about it. And yeah, if you think about it, the scale of it, 4 by 4.5 feet, for those of you who have not seen it, you get a sense of it's a big space that you're being invited into. And it works to bring us into another world. And it does this in a way that is virtually unprecedented. And we don't have to know, we don't have to be as astute as those erudite Venetians at that time. We immediately respond to this work of art. People have always responded to it. We get it. We understand that it's St. Francis. We understand the moment. And we feel drawn into his experience. And it helps us connect with him and the whole story that this is about. It's just fantastic.
It is fantastic. Bill, you know, there are a few things that you can encounter in a career, particularly in education. And one of those is when you do such a good job that you leave no room for questions. And that's what you have done tonight. We have no questions. So I think you have, from top to bottom, side to side, we've done a pretty nice entry into this piece. So
it's been fun.
I want to thank you, Bill. I want to thank you, Sarah, for a most amazing evening of setting a very high bar for Viewing Room Live, the first of our voyages tonight. So thank you.
Thank you, Bill Conger and the Peoria Riverfront Museum. It's you guys are doing great work, and as a team, I think we're all happy to be part of that community and bringing people into the community this way, our community online. even though I felt like the museum guard was going to get us in trouble because we were so close to the painting. This ability to bring our community together, our museum family together, is terrific. So Bill Conger, thank you kindly.
You're very welcome. We got closer to it tonight.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone. Tune in for another Viewing Room Live soon. Hope you enjoyed it. Please visit our virtual museum at Peoria Riverfront Museum, our website, and check us on social media. We have tons of stuff going on all the time, trying to bring you content. Hope you enjoyed. Please come see us again.
And stay well.
And stay well. Good night.
Good night.